He died a giant. He left more money than any American had ever seen, and 2 generations later, his family was broke enough to auction their own palaces. Why did that happen? You'll hear the numbers. You'll hear the rules. You'll hear the human choices that turned fortune into folklore. In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, died with an estate listed at more than $100 million. By modern reckoning, that's roughly $200 billion. He built railroads. He built a fortune. He left behind children who would never run railroads again. But here's the structural flaw. After that urgent opening, breathe in. Let the story settle. We'll move slowly now and listen to how a singular man's distrust of his heirs produced a long, quiet erosion of skill, stewardship, and eventually, money. Cornelius Vanderbilt made his wealth in the rough and tumble world of 19th century transportation, steamboats, then rail. He governed an empire with practical instincts, hard bargains, and intimate knowledge of logistics. The man who could see a rail line and imagine profit also saw his children differently. He worried that too much cash would corrupt them or let them waste what he had fought to create. That refusal to fully entrust the next generation changed everything. It led to legal structures that insulated capital but imprisoned experience. Young Vanderbilts received what you could call income, allowances, trust payments, comfortable lives, but not real responsibility. They were stewards by stipend, not by apprenticeship. That's the turning point. Income without authority is a peculiar teacher. It trains taste more than judgment. Where a family might have been taught how to manage investments or run companies, the Vanderbilt heirs were taught how to spend and how to maintain appearances. They learned to inhabit rooms, not boardrooms. They could maintain a staff of servants, but not a railway workforce. They became excellent patrons of art, patrons of architecture, patrons of society, but not patrons of enterprise. In the decades after the Commodore's death, the family's identity crystallized around show houses. Over the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Vanderbilts built 10 massive mansions along Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. Imagine a single block stretching with marble facades, Ottoman rugs, sweeping staircases, conservatories like greenhouses for public display. Each house was a statement, power made visible. But each house also came with hidden ledgers, heating bills, staff payrolls, taxes, repairs, and the ever-present cost of keeping up with neighbors whose houses were getting bigger and newer. Here's what no one anticipated. Those mansions were more than homes. They were financial engines in reverse. Each brick, each ornate fixture, each imported tapestry translated into a recurring drain on capital. In the Gilded Age, income from railroads was massive, but it was also subject to shifting markets, emerging competitors, and later, regulatory and tax changes. The houses required steady cash streams. Trust payments could cover that for a time. But when tax law changed, or market returns softened, the math began to bend. This is where the system breaks down. The federal estate tax, introduced in 1916, was a legal earthquake for old fortunes. It meant that every great death now potentially created huge tax liabilities. Families that had kept wealth concentrated through trusts faced new calculations, paying taxes out of principal, selling assets, or mortgaging the very palaces they wanted to preserve. For families like the Vanderbilts, who had spread consumption widely and concentrated control sparsely, this was a brutal mismatch, and that's the hidden cost. But taxes were only part of the story. There was also structural dilution. The Commodore had perhaps a dozen children, and by the early 20th century, the family branches multiplied. Each generation added more claimants. Even where trusts preserved nominal wealth, the number of beneficiaries exploded. An enormous fortune divided across a vast family produces a per-person share that can look impressive in round numbers and negligible in practice. But the real shift was quieter. The way capital was held mattered as much as how much there was. Trusts often restricted what heirs could do. Income only, limited control, or trustees who were external professionals. Those protections stopped reckless dissipation, but they also stopped apprenticeship. If young heirs could not vote shares, take board seats, or be taught to run parts of the business, they never learned the skills necessary to grow or preserve capital themselves. Stewardship became a job for trustees and lawyers, not for family members. That's when the math stopped working. When you combine rising expenses, new taxes, and a broad base of beneficiaries with a cadre of heirs who lack business competency, the only remaining options are to sell assets or shrink lifestyles. After decades, that's what happened to the Fifth Avenue houses. By 1947, each of those 10 mansions had been either demolished or sold at auction. Marble and gilt returned to the market. Ballrooms emptied. Private art collections dispersed. The grand sweep of an earlier century yielded to the quieter needs of balance sheets. Yet the result surprised everyone. If the mansions fell, the family's reputation didn't crumble immediately. In fact, social capital carried them for a long while. The Vanderbilts were always at the right parties and on the guest lists. But social capital is not the same as financial capital. The cost of maintaining a status-based identity is recurring and relentless. Without active reinvestment and without heirs trained in managing enterprises, the family's capital base slowly eroded. On paper, it looked stable. It wasn't. By 1973, a small documentary detail captures the human arithmetic. 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion, and not one of them was a millionaire. A family that once held what we could call a modern equivalent of $200 billion now counted a crowd of relatives who had comfortable lives, but no individuals with independently impressive fortunes. Momentum turned into erosion. There are many proximate causes people point to: bad investments, extravagant spending, high taxes, shifts in industry. All of those matter. But when you examine the sequence, the origin is structural and psychological. The Commodore's decision to withhold real authority from his heirs created what I call an estate planning vacuum. It's a vacuum not of documents but of experience. What followed felt inevitable but wasn't. Consider human capital, the non-financial skill set that allows someone to steward wealth: negotiation, accounting, operational oversight, crisis management, and the moral sense of stewardship. In families where heirs work in the business, perhaps starting at the mailroom and learning the trade, this human capital accumulates. It can adapt to markets and reinvest intelligently. Where heirs exist mainly as recipients of income, those competencies rarely develop. The quiet decisions mattered most. There's an irony here. Many wealthy founders aim to protect their heirs by limiting access to capital until heirs demonstrate responsibility. That can work. But if the limitations go too far, if access is permanent but power is forever withheld, the heirs never have the chance to prove themselves. Restrictions can create dependent beneficiaries who are ill-equipped to make strategic choices when the protections loosen or when market shocks arrive. Control became a barrier, not a benefit. The Vanderbilt story also exposes a governance problem. Trustees and family lawyers are fiduciaries by design. They should act in the beneficiary's best interests. But fiduciary management by outsiders can prioritize capital preservation in the short term, while failing to foster internal capacity. With each generation, the family loses institutional memory, the way decisions get made, the taste for risk, the network of relationships that opens deal flow. Without formal family governance, boards of family members, educational programs, staged responsibilities, wealth acts like an annuity rather than a business. Inheritance became a lesson in dependence. There is also a social dimension worth noting. Marriages among the Vanderbilts often connected them to other wealthy families, bringing dowries, social ties, and new spending impulses. Those alliances can amplify consumption. When social standing becomes the primary currency, families spend to renew status. Ballrooms, carriage houses, philanthropic naming rights. Those are legitimate uses of wealth, but when they outpace returns, capital recedes. Privilege started to look fragile. The forensic economic picture grows clearer when you map assets against liabilities. Asset values in railways and real estate are subject to cycles. The rail industry that made the Commodore rich matured and consolidated. Real estate in Manhattan appreciated, but maintenance and taxation rose. Meanwhile, more of the family held stakes in fewer enterprises. The combination of illiquidity, rising costs, and fragmented claims is a classic recipe for forced sales. Wealth began to leak in small ways. Small leaks compound. A conservatory roof unrepaired. A generation of trustees satisfied with yield rather than growth. A set of beneficiaries who expect income but do not fund legacy-building ventures. Each is a slow loss. In the aggregate, over decades, these losses morph into tangible declines. Fewer holdings, smaller endowments, houses on the market, and ultimately, descendants who are not millionaires. An absence of instruction proved decisive. Now, this is not a tale of moral failing. Many Vanderbilt heirs were generous, cultured, and public-spirited. They funded libraries, museums, and universities. They supported social causes. But generosity without generative stewardship cannot indefinitely sustain a dynasty. Philanthropy spent principal in ways that prestige required. When that spending occurred alongside a lack of business training, the combined effect was attrition. Legal structures produced perverse incentives. Trusts that pay out large allowances but leave investment decisions to a small set of professionals can disincentivize heirs from engaging. Why learn to manage a railroad when you receive enough to live splendidly? Over time, the family's role shifts from active owner to passive recipient. That shift diminishes civic leadership in the sectors that originally created the wealth. The family's certainty became a liability. There's one more structural dynamic to consider: concentration risk. Cornelius concentrated capital in rail and in the investment philosophy that produced large returns in a specific era. He did not, and perhaps could not foresee, the restructuring of American industry, the ascent of automobiles and highways, the regulatory changes, the new tax regimes, and the Great Depression. A nimble ownership class adapts. A passive one cannot. In the end, the numbers told a different story. What began as a story about money becomes a story about education, governance, and psychological inheritance. The Commodore's distrust was a protective instinct. But protective instincts that become ossified rules will, over time, calcify a family's capacities. The Vanderbilt dynasty did not implode in a dramatic crash. It trickled away across generations through legal constructs that kept money insulated and people untrained. Now think about the human scenes. Picture a young Vanderbilt in the 1890s, a life of tutors and debutante balls, a conservatory that smells of orange blossoms and wax polish. He or she could buy anything. They could not, however, run rail maintenance or negotiate with freight managers. Later, in the 1930s, picture the same family paying a trustee's fee and staring at balance sheets where dividend yield has flattened. The conversations change. They are no longer about expansion. They are about preservation. Eventually, the houses are auctioned, and the family sits together in a rented hall for a reunion in 1973. A crowd of 120, dignified, but without a single millionaire among them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how money really passes, or doesn't, between generations, consider subscribing for more stories that combine history, law, and human behavior. It helps me keep researching and bringing these episodes to you. There are concrete lessons for families and for anyone who studies institutional preservation. First, design trusts with education in mind. Include staged governance roles, apprenticeships, and accountability milestones. Second, diversify not only financial assets but also human capital. Teach heirs to manage projects, negotiate contracts, and lead people. Third, align incentives so that beneficiaries can both inherit and earn the right to steward capital. Finally, Create family governance structures that preserve institutional memory, minutes, bylaws, family councils, and documented lessons from previous crises. The emotional lesson is equally important. Money can't replace the instinct to learn, to fail, and to try again. A family that denies its younger members the chance to make mistakes also denies them the chance to grow into responsible custodians. The Commodore may have been right to worry about waste, but his solution prevented a necessary apprenticeship. As we move into the present, the Vanderbilt case becomes a cautionary tale for new fortunes created in tech, finance, and other rapid growth sectors. Today's founders face similar temptations: lock up capital, protect heirs, and never expose them to the messy work that made the money in the first place. The difference is that modern families have models and tools to prevent an estate planning vacuum: blended trusts, family offices with training programs, public-private partnerships, and explicit succession paths. Privilege is not a guarantee. It is, at best, an opportunity to cultivate competence. When that cultivation fails, the result is not just lost wealth, it's lost potential. It is the erosion of influence that could have been used to build companies, create jobs, and fund public goods. In the final analysis, the Vanderbilt story is less about decadence and more about a missing curriculum. It's about what we teach the next generation: how to manage resources, how to take responsibility, how to convert privilege into stewardship. The Commodore gave his descendants comfort. He did not, in sufficient measure, give them competence. If this episode made you think differently about wealth and inheritance, leave a comment or share it with someone who cares about family legacies. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive. The demolition of those Fifth Avenue mansions is a freeze frame of loss. The auction gavel strikes are a rhythm of finality. And yet, the quiet scenes, the trustees' signatures, the trustees' silence, the children taught to admire rather than to build, are the real markers of decline. They are the forensic traces we can read if we know how to look. So what would a different choice have looked like? Imagine the Commodore instituting structured apprenticeships. Imagine families combining stipends with operational roles: a stipend for study, a board seat at 25, a supervised management role at 30. Imagine trustees whose charters included education clauses, not just preservation clauses. Those interventions would have kept human capital alive inside the family, allowing assets to be actively managed and grown, rather than slowly parceled away. That matters because dynasties that last do not simply own assets, they renew them. They teach a craft, a discipline, a set of practices that survive each generation. When legal forms substitute for lived experience, the dynasty becomes an exhibit rather than an engine. This is where modern families and policymakers can learn from the past. Estate planning should not be only about how to minimize taxes or how to avoid profligacy. It should be about sustaining capability. Wealth without skill, like a great house with no upkeep, eventually collapses. So when you picture the Vanderbilts, those grand houses, the silk curtains, the orchestral soirees, remember to also picture the small ledger entries: trustee fees, conservatory repairs, the cost of a carriage team in a changing world. Those small numbers add up. They tell the story of a dynasty's decline as clearly as any dramatic headline. Privilege can be a platform for responsibility, or it can be a velvet cushion that numbs initiative. The difference is simple: education, authority, and accountability. In the quiet after the auctioneers stopped speaking and the last chandeliers were packed away, what remained were lessons, not just for the Vanderbilts, but for anyone who wants their wealth to become a lasting institution rather than a fading anecdote. If you liked this episode, consider subscribing and sharing. There are more of these stories, of families, finance, and the fragile architecture that holds fortunes together. They are a map of how societies pass value across time and how they sometimes fail. Thank you for listening. If you carry one idea from this story, let it be this: to protect a legacy, you must teach a successor to create one.